Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. This is a little after 9 o'clock. Good morning. Let me make sure I'm all set. We have a weird setup because of the lunch today, so with the tables and all that good stuff. This is the last of my Paul classes this week. I know. Huh?
Yeah. I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
This is the last of the Paul classes this week.
Oh.
So.
We did 3 and this week or did last.
Yeah. So we're gonna completely solve Paul today and wrap it up.
Are you sure?
We're gonna try. Excuse me. Yeah.
Your series continues next week.
No, I'm done after this. So I wish it would. Like I said that first week, I could just go on and on. We could do this all year. We could read Paul verse by verse. You look so excited about that. No, Ed Decker will be leading a class next week. I'm not sure what it's on, but I'm sure it'll be very good. But today, St. Paul, friend or foe, the last one, we'll come to a consensus. We'll take a vote. We'll let the congregation know the position on Paul. So last week we heard from Pete Enns. When I went up to talk to him after the class, he said, "I hope I didn't mess your class up too much." I said, "No, you set us up perfectly." He just put us on the runway for what we're going to talk about today. So I was I thought his talk last week was really interesting, all the talks he did. So anyway, let's get into it. Very briefly, I won't read that long definition of what Paul said his mission was again. But I do want to touch real quick on the 7 concepts that we talked about 2 weeks ago, because those are going to be pretty important for what we're doing today. So 2 weeks ago we talked about Paul's theology, what it is he was writing about in his letters, what it is he was trying to do, and we did that through these 7 different terms. Cruciform, everything is cross-shaped for Paul. Our second one was covenant. We talked a lot about the Jewish covenant and Paul's concept of this new covenant through Christ, that not just for the Jewish people, but for everybody to enter into, and how a covenant is kind of that two-way street. God does something, we do something. Freedom was the next one. Freedom, not just freedom from restriction, but freedom for, or what are we freed for? These theological virtues, faith, hope, and most of all, love. We're going to talk about those a bit more today. We briefly touched on these heavy terms, especially justification, salvation, righteousness, reconciliation. I could have gone into sanctification. That was one I forgot to put on that list. And participatory. Pete talked quite a bit about this last week, how the message that we're called into, that cruciform covenant love, is one that we participate in through Christ, and through the resurrection is what Paul thought. And finally, countercultural. This is kind of where we lead today. What does the community of cruciform-shaped people, of people living in this new covenant, of people shaped by this new kind of freedom, what does it look like? It's countercultural. It's a colony, like referencing Hauerwas again, it's a colony of resident aliens within another society. And then briefly, the thing that Pete did so well last week, I was so jealous, was just like this simple, these nice question and answer, and this kind of flowing move across all of Paul's theology. I was like, man, I wish I was as good enough to have done what he did. So he started by asking this question, or posing this question, that this is the question that Paul was obsessed with, is Jesus the Messiah? And he said, yes. Why did Paul consider Jesus the Messiah? Because of the resurrection specifically. Why would God raise the dead? This is when he got into the 4th Maccabee stuff. And I don't know if you guys follow Pete on Instagram and TikTok and stuff. We inspired him. He was putting up videos about 4th Maccabees this week. So I was like, we did that. We got his brain thinking about it. So anyway, why would God raise the dead? Because God is just. God's not going to put people into a covenant and give them salvation and then just let them not exist forever. But Jesus' resurrection in the now versus in the future represents the arrival of our future time now. That was that already, but not yet, that Pete talked about. But we are called to participate in Jesus' resurrection life in the here and now via a new community of Jews and Gentiles unified in love. So very briefly, that's kind of what we've seen the last 2 weeks. And I just wanted to get those ideas back in your head because we're going to kind of put them together today to take us where we're going to go. And what we're doing today is really answering this big question. This is kind of where I've been pointing at this entire time. And this is a question that for a long time did bother me about Paul, still bothers me about Paul. First of all, what does this new community that Paul is envisioning look like? And if Paul is talking about things like love in 1 Corinthians and trying to build these bridges across the divide of Jew and Gentile, why in the world is he talking about things like women's role in the church? Why is he talking about sexuality? Why is he talking about slavery? And why are his takes on those things so bad if he's going to talk about them? That's kind of the question I've been grappling with for a long time. I think that's the question a lot of people are grappling with around Paul, is why did he do these things? And it's the question we're going to try to tackle today in some form. We'll see. I have handouts for you that you just came in, if you would like them. So, any thoughts or questions on our brief recap? Yes. Oh, sorry, Anita, you came in too. And I was in the flow when you came in, so there you go.
Thank you.
All right, any questions or thoughts on anything before we launch into some new stuff? Anything stemming from what we heard last week with Pete? All right, I just want to make sure. Okay, so this question, what does this new community look like? This is where we're at. I have a sort of an answer for you. And it's that 7th term we've come back to. This community that Paul is envisioning, that's come into being because of the resurrection of it. And these people recognizing the resurrection and trying to live into this new way of life, this here and the now, is a counterculture. Paul saw it as a community of people living in opposition to the way of the world, which at the time would have been the Roman Empire. I typed this up. This kind of brings it all together. I thought this was really clever. But countercultural because of our participation in that cruciform covenant. All right, so as we participate in the cruciform death of Jesus, living in, remember that cruciform way is to live in a self-giving way, living in a primary loving way. That is a countercultural way of being. We're living in a covenant with one another and with God. And through that, this is what we talked about, do that. Through that covenant, God takes on the burden of our faithfulness, of our need to live rightly. Through that covenant, God says, you don't have to worry about doing everything right. Right? This is what we talked about with the loving for. You just go out and you live with faith and hope, and most of all love, and you love everybody, and you do the right things, and let God worry about the rest. All right. I think Paul understood that, and I think we should understand this as something that really is quite a radical way of being. I often think about it in terms of abundance. I think we've heard that language around here. That was a language that came up when I was in seminary quite a bit. So we live abundantly. We can love abundantly. We don't have to worry about the scarcity of resources or the scarcity of our time or the scarcity of our attention through the cross, through our cruciform living, through this freeing from the power of sin and the power of death. We are freed to live in a really abundant way and to give abundantly. And in a society and in a culture that's really predicated on scarcity, on us competing with one another for what we have and for what others have, we can live abundantly and give up to others. And that really changes people. That really changes the way we think about things. I can tell what you're thinking. What does this have to do with women not speaking in church? What does this have to do with Paul justifying slavery in Philemon? How is a community that is countercultural also a community that's still oppressing women, also a community that's still keeping people in slavery, also a community that is not welcoming of sexual minorities? How do we balance these two things? How do we keep those two things together? And I want to do that. So here's how I want to do that. To see how we kind of dissolve that knot that really difficult not to get through. I want to look at a really important verse from Paul that is one of these ethical takes. It's one of these social situations that can be really difficult, that can be really hard to get our heads around, that seems really problematic. I want to talk about 1 Corinthians 8, which is where Paul talks about eating meat from idols, because I know we're really concerned about that in our church today. Thank you, Julie, on a rainy Sunday morning. We're going to talk about 1 Corinthians 8. I didn't give you that one. I've got it here because we don't necessarily need to go through it line by line. But I want to show how, get my whiteboard here. I want to show how Paul's theology can be understood in three ways. All these 7 terms can be applied in 3 different ways to everything Paul talks about. To his talk about women, to his talk about eating meat from idols, to his talk about slavery. All right? So if we understand Paul's theology as, first of all, contextual, we'll talk about what these mean. It's contextual. If we talk about it, again, as countercultural, we've already briefly touched on that. And if we talk about it as always inclusive, we'll talk about how we can do that. So contextual first. Paul is, first of all, always, remember we talked about his letters, he's always writing to communities. He's always writing in a context of a church doing something, and he's responding to them doing something, whether it's Corinthians or Romans or whoever. He's writing within a context. So our first thing that when we encounter these really problematic verses that we should understand is that he's writing to a time and place that is not us. And that we should, my contention is we should allow him to do that. It's tied to what I talked about way back in our very first week with Paul's Jewishness, that we can't strip him of his Jewishness. To do so is a form, I think, of cultural imperialism. That he was Jewish. He was a first century man. He lived in this world. He had to exist in this world. He was trying to succeed in some form in this world in planting these new churches. And so he exists within a context. The concept, I think, one brief justification of how he approaches these topics is that I think that the idea of completely co-equality of the genders would have been completely outside the cultural norms of the time. I don't think it's something they could have conceived of as being even a question to pose, right? So contextual is the first way we read Paul. So when we think about, let me move on from contextual. Countercultural is what we've talked about. Always read Paul through this countercultural lens, that he is upending things, that he is setting forth a new community, all right? It's contextual, but it's countercultural. And always read it as inclusive. This takes us back to that first week too. If we think about Paul in relation to what Peter and John are doing, right? That Paul is setting up is posing a church that is opening its doors to the Gentiles and opening its doors wider and wider to more and more people, right? Whereas Peter and John in the Jerusalem church really still viewed it as a sect of Judaism, really still thought people should be circumcised and follow the law and do all those things. Whereas Paul is envisioning something broader and trying to spread a more inclusive tone. So if we keep that spirit of inclusivity when we read these verses, I think it really highlights a lot too. So I want to talk about 1 Corinthians 8 to see how these three things work, because it may not be apparent to you. So in 1 Corinthians 8, here's what Paul is doing. He is writing to Corinth about a problem they're having. Some of the people in the church, the Gentile members of the church, are going down to the market before they go to the shared community dinner, which would have been their equivalent of a Lord's Supper. They're going down to the market and they're buying food. And they're buying meat that has been sacrificed to pagan idols. So often, one of the pagan temples would have brought in an ox and they would have slaughtered it and they would have burned its flesh or burned parts of it on the altar, and then they would have taken the leftover flesh that the priest didn't want to eat and they would have sold it back to the people as food. And so some of the members in Corinth are going down and buying that meat and preparing it and bringing it to the feast, the Christian feast, the love feast of the community, and eating it. And for the Jewish members of the Corinth church, this was a problem. That's unclean food. It has been in a pagan temple. It has been treated in an unclean way. I don't know, for all we know, they were bringing pork in there too, and that would have been considered unclean as well. All right, so Paul is writing to resolve this problem. There's this big conflict going on between these two factions in the Corinth church. All right, we say And so likely the conversation was the Jewish members are saying, well, this stuff is unclean. We're not supposed to have this. Even if we're not following Jewish law, this is a really hard cultural habit to break. This feeling like, even if somebody came up to you and told you like, hey, like this grasshopper, it's not unclean. You can really eat this grasshopper. That's a really hard habit to break, right? Like it's not something you're gonna get out of. Meanwhile, the Gentiles on the other side are saying, you've abolished the law. You've said, we don't have to worry about this anymore. And that's perfectly good ox meat from the market. We're gonna go get it and eat it and bring it into our feast. So Paul is writing to the church in Corinth to resolve this issue. He spends a lot of time on this. He spends all of chapter 8, chapters 9 and 10, he builds theology on top of it, and then chapter 11, he addresses it again. He spends like 4 whole chapters just on this one thing. This is the ethical issue he spends like the most page time on of any one ethical issue. So to resolve it, he does this really interesting thing. First, he writes, let me find the right place to start here. The first thing he writes in chapter 8 is he says, food won't bring us close to God. We're not missing out if we don't eat, and we don't have any advantage if we do eat. But watch out, or else this freedom of yours might be a problem for those who are weak. Suppose someone sees you eating in an idol's temple. Won't the person with a weak conscience be encouraged to eat the meat sacrificed to false gods? The weak brother or sister for whom Christ died is destroyed by your knowledge. Your sin against Christ is your sin against your brothers and sisters, and hurt their weak consciences this way. This is why if food causes the downfall of my brother and sister, I won't eat meat ever again, or else I may cause my brother or sister to fall. The interesting move Paul makes here is not commending them that they do have to follow the Jewish law. What he's saying is, there's nothing wrong with that meat. There's nothing wrong with eating that meal in that way. But if by doing so, you are causing harm, you are causing anguish, religious, mental anguish to your brothers and sisters in Christ, you should not do it. Whether it's right or wrong. You should be self-giving enough, loving of others enough that you refrain from doing the thing, even if the thing you think you are doing is not the bad thing. Okay? So that's the first move he makes here. Then he comes back in verses 11, or in chapter 11, and he gets specific about his instructions of how to eat meals together. And he says, I don't praise you as I give the following instructions, because when you meet together, it does more harm than good. First of all, when you meet together as a church, I hear there are divisions among you, and I partly believe it. It's necessary that there are groups among you to make clear who is genuine. So when you get together in one place, it isn't to eat the Lord's meal. Each of you goes ahead and eat your own private meal. When one person goes hungry, while another is drunk. Don't you all have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you look down on God's churches and humiliate those who have nothing? What can I say to you? Will I praise you? No, I don't praise you in this. So he's done 2 things here. I know this is a lot of Bible verses, and this is probably seeming really dense, but he's done 2 main things across chapters 8 and 11. He's really emphasized that they don't have to follow these Levitical laws, all right? But they do have to love one another in whatever form that takes. And he has told them in that second verse, that chapter 11 verse, what he's telling them there is, the most important thing when you come together is being equal together at the table. He says to them, you're coming together and you're all having your own little meals, and some of you are eating these big heaping portions of this meat that you bought at the idol, and some of you bring bread and water, I don't know, just a little bit, and have to be hungry and they have to sit at this lesser table. He's saying, when you come together, your rule is to love one another, to be equal to one another, and to support one another. All right? So why am I talking about this? I think that these verses are a really good example of these 3 things. This is a contextual situation that Paul is writing about. He's writing about a very specific situation that we don't ever have to deal with. We don't have to worry about meat from an idol or a temple. He's establishing something that's really countercultural, all right, by asking the Jews to not worry about the Jewish law anymore, but asking the Gentiles to be willing to sacrifice their privileges in order to make their brothers and sisters feel a little less anguish in this meal. And finally, he's asking them to be inclusive. Above all, it comes back to him, is everybody is welcome in this church setting together. We all come together, we all share a meal. We're not going to do things that exclude one another. We're not going to do things that hurt one another. We're going to be inclusive together. We're going to welcome as many people into our church as possible. These three things you can apply, I think, to any of the social teachings that Paul talks about. So whether he talks about women, whether he talks about slavery, when he talks about, if we looked at, we don't have time to, but if we looked at Romans 12 with his talk about powers and principalities and how to relate to the government. I think if you apply these three things, which we've learned through our reading of Paul's theology, all right, I think it starts to resolve some of those. So let's look at the Bible verse that I gave you, which is Ephesians 5-6. Let me make sure I have one. So this is where he really talks about, well, I should say he. Ephesians is one of the letters that we established a couple weeks ago that there are questions about whether Paul authored it or not. I kind of come down to the position that Paul probably didn't sit down and write Ephesians himself, but that it came from the community around Paul. Shares a lot of affinity with his theology. It's very close to what Paul thought. It's just stylistically a little bit different. So in this long Bible verse that I printed for you, Cross 5 and 6, he talks about, this is the famous wives should submit to their husbands as to the Lord verses that we don't like, that I don't like at all. You guys met Tabitha. Tell her to submit to me. She should submit to the Lord. Goodness gracious. So I want to read this just to talk about how these things can be even used to undermine these kind of verses and to reread them. And this is important because these are the things that get thrown at us, right? A lot by more fundamentalist and conservative churches. That this is what the Bible says. This is what we're supposed to do. But we can throw it back and say, no, that's not a good way to read Paul. You can't pick and choose. We can't cherry pick one little verse. You have to read it in this whole context. You have to read the whole thing to get what he's saying. All right? So if you look at that verse, I'll read a little bit from it here. It says, so be careful to live your life wisely, not foolishly. Take advantage of every opportunity because these are evil times. Because of this, don't be ignorant, but understand the Lord's will. Don't get drunk on wine, which produces depravity. Instead, be filled with the Spirit in the following ways. Speak to each other with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Sing and make music to the Lord in your heart. Always give thanks to God the Father for everything in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. And submit to each other out of respect for Christ. That verse 21 is really important. His first instruction, submit to each other out of respect for Christ. Doesn't name anybody. It's just a general instruction to submit. For example, wives should submit to their husbands as if to the Lord. You. A husband is the head of the wife like Christ is the head of the church. That is the Savior of the body. So wives submit to their husbands in everything like the church submits to Christ. As for husbands, love your wives just like Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. He did this to make her holy by washing in a bath of water with the word. He did this to present himself with a splendid church, one without any sort of stain or wrinkle, So it's not just instructions for women. It's also instructions for the husbands. And what does he tell them to do? To love as Christ loved the church. And what did Christ do for the church? According to Paul, died. So there's an ultimate form of submission there. So there's two instructions here, right? We move down just a little bit to where it says, verse 6, the next paragraph. As for children, obey your parents in the Lord because it is right. The commandment, honor your mother and father, is the first one with a promise attached. As for parents, don't provoke your children to anger, but raise them with discipline and instruction about the Lord. So again, instructions to children and to parents, which Gorman points out in his book was really countercultural. To tell parents to don't provoke your children to anger, to instruct. You have to understand that in this first century context, the head of the household, the patriarch of the household, had absolute authority over everybody in his household, to the point of death. Could put his family members to death if he thought it was deserved, and the law could not question it. So for Paul to even give instructions for how parents should relate to their children, that's like, people would have read that and said, Paul, you're really stepping over the line of what is in your power to tell me to do and what is not in your power to tell me to do. All right? Final, that last paragraph. As for slaves, obey your human masters with fear and trembling, and with severe devotion to Christ. Don't work to make yourself look good and try to flatter people. If you jump down to verse 8, as for masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Stop threatening them because you know that both you and your slaves have a master in heaven. He doesn't distinguish between people on the basis of status. So again, two instructions. Slaves, follow your masters. Masters, treat your slaves in the exact same way. act towards your slaves in the exact same way that they act towards you. Inclusive, countercultural, but also contextual. He's not in a position to overthrow patriarchal Roman culture or slavery as an entire human practice. But he is in a position to instruct his churches that even with these cultural and societal markers of exclusion and a hierarchy, even within those, that Christians are called to live in complete equality and complete submission to one another, regardless of any of those other things. Gorman, in this book, puts it a lot better than I could ever put it. He says, an attempt to apply the notion of mutual submission, of mutual cruciformity or Christ-like love to an inherently patriarchal structure. That's what Paul's doing throughout all his ethical teachings. He calls it revolutionary, challenging the assumptions, and a radical restructuring of relationships. I can't emphasize enough like how important that is. Like the way that Paul writes about these things, we focus on the fact that he writes about them at all. That he writes these things, wives submit to your husbands, slaves submit to your masters. But we're taking it out of a context that was completely radical, that was completely revolutionary way of thinking about the world for people. They would have had to sit and like completely like rearrange the mental structures of how they understood culture to operate, to live in this way. The radical image of headship here is of a crucified Lord, power and weakness and self-giving love. This one's really important too, because I think one of the things that challenges us about Paul is we see him saying, husbands be like Christ. And we think about Christ in the way that the evangelical church in America thinks about Christ. Exalted, glorified, holy, lording over the earth. But that's not how Paul thought about Jesus. Paul thought about Jesus on the cross. Remember, Jesus is cruciform, first and foremost. Jesus sacrificed and died for the people he loved. And so when he tells husbands and fathers and slave masters, be like Christ towards those who in this culture are told to submit to you, he's telling them, be willing to give of yourself to them to the point of death, if that's what it takes. Again, this is really intense, radical stuff. And this, it's almost enough you can read it and laugh and get a little excited about it. And the next time a fundamentalist says, well, God says for you to submit, if you're a wife, to submit to your husbands, and you can say, well, does that mean you're willing to die for your wife today, right now? It'd be an interesting question. One last quote. Fathers are to exercise their paternal obligations of discipline and instruction in ways that are consistent with the Lord, that is, with the kind love of God in Christ. Again, every time we're reading about these verses and we're talking about what it looks like to live in submission to one another, is that cruciform. It is with these theological virtues of faith, hope, and love in mind. I hope this is making sense.
I feel like I have a little bit of cognitive dissonance about the verse 22 or something about submitting. So that's more culture, you might say. Christ of culture, not against culture.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if you, and I doubt that Paul had access like the, on the Last Supper, the washing of the feet, which would be a servant sort of leadership. Now, if I reinterpret it that way, I'm good with it. But if I interpret the way it was in culture, that's one of the reasons I would question if we go with, well, it has to be countercultural. Well, this kind of almost speaks to, no, don't, calm down. We're not subverting the culture here. We're staying within that. So to me, it was, what was originally preached was just too radical. Yeah. And so later they kind of watered down Paul.
Yeah, I think so. But I also think it's important to when you read verse 22, which says wives submit to husbands. It's the same instruction he's making to husbands, right? Like they're all supposed to submit to one another in a Christ-like way, self-giving way. The first instruction comes above. That's why I pointed that out, right? In verse, I think it was 21. Yeah, submit to each other out of respect for Christ. That's the overarching instruction that he's giving here. And then he gives examples: husbands and wives, fathers and children, slaves and masters. Those are all examples of this key instruction: submit to each other out of respect for Christ. And it's this back and forth, like husbands, give yourself up for your wives, and then wives in turn give yourself to husband. Recently on Facebook, I was involved in this conversation with some friends from seminary talking about wealth in the church and what does it mean to be wealthy and what is the role of the wealthy. And one of the examples I made in there was tied to this, that because somebody asked, well, what does it mean to be wealthy? Wealthy today is very different from what it meant to be wealthy when Paul wrote or when Jesus talked about wealth. And I wrote in there that wealth is always contextual and it's always relative. And so I said, wealth operates in the situation where I have $2 and you have $1. And what Jesus' self-giving love looks like is you and I handing that extra dollar back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth in submission to one another. It looks ridiculous. It looks completely stupid. But what did Paul say? God's foolishness is the foolishness of men, but it's the strength of God, right? Like, it doesn't look like it makes sense, but that's why it's countercultural. It doesn't have to make sense to the way people would say, well, how do you run a family like this? I don't know. How do you run a family like this? I don't know.
I remember being in a discussion in a seminary church history class about the idea of slavery in the ancient world, and like you said, everything's contextual, and we always hear when we in our American context hear slavery, we go right to American enslavement, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in the ancient world, I mean, we were Europeans and colonists were sadly the only people in civilization who ever went and kidnapped people off of their native territory and transported them and sold them as chattel, right? Enslavement in Paul's context would mean the people that were occupied. And so there were somebody was always being occupied by somebody, the Greeks or the Romans or whoever were occupying all the territories they could pick up. And so enslavement simply meant more like indentured servanthood.
Yeah. Well, and to think about it too, to take slavery, like you were saying, take slavery out of our current context, take it out of the capitalist context.
Right.
Where peasants, working class people, were not like putting in a day's labor to earn their wages. They were subsistence. They were trying to get the food and the materials they needed to live on a day-by-day basis. One thing that people in ancient Rome would do was sell themselves into slavery because it was a guarantee. They had a roof over their head and they had a meal on their table every night. That was the master's job, was to provide them food and shelter, and their job was to work. And they willingly sold themselves into slavery because they weren't it wasn't like it was either slavery or live in my own house and make a wage. It was slavery or live in my own house and not know where my next meal is coming from.
But another piece of that, isn't it? We make it more about color of skin, whereas
Right.
ancient didn't have, it wasn't,
Well, it was more
didn't have anything to
cultural.
do with the color of your skin.
Right. It was more not countercultural, but other cultures, and like the whole, like the whole second chapter of Acts of when the Spirit was coming down. There were Parthians and there were Medes and there were this and there were that. There were so many different subcultures, tribes really, living in different places that Rome had control of all of them.
Yeah. Well, and the worst people want to take this one verse, Ephesians 5. As for slaves, obey your human masters with fear and trembling. But they completely miss, for instance, the entire book of Philemon, which is Paul writing to a slave master with a letter he sends with a runaway slave, commending him, saying, you need to take your slave back, and you can't punish him for running away, first of all. And in fact, you need to treat him as an equal to you. And in fact, your slave, you need to submit to your slave, because your slave is your brother in Christ. They leave out that part. Again, completely contextual, completely countercultural, and also inclusive, telling them they are equal, no matter what society says they are, slave or master, Jew or Gentile, male or female. He's saying everybody is equal under the cross and under God's love. And you should act like it, you should live like it. Getting close to the end of our time, so I want to move us towards the end here. And I want to make the big kind of point that all of this has been pushing towards over the course of these 3 weeks that I've taught, 4 weeks for the total class. What I think is important about Paul is not stray single verses that somebody may quote to you about women or sexuality or slavery. You can do that with anybody in the Bible, with any part of the Bible. Fundamentalists, conservatives, whatever term you want to do it, they may want to use Paul in that way, but they're missing the point. Reading Paul is a holistic exercise. And that's what I hope that if nothing else you take away from this, you take away this point. Paul's really complicated and hard. You can't just grab little pieces of Paul. You can't grab one verse here and one verse there and say, this is what Paul's all about. Paul has to be read in the entirety. And that's why people have been reading and struggling with Paul for 2,000 years now. You can't grab Romans 1:27 where he condemns homosexuality. You have to read that verse in the context of the argument he's making across the end of chapter 1 and into chapter 2, and the broader argument he's making through Romans 1 through 3, which is like the prelude to the argument he's making across the entire letter. You have to read it all together. And it's really hard to do. And honestly, like, even as somebody who went to seminary and who reads a lot of Paul, and like, this is one of my big passions theologically, I don't even necessarily feel very qualified to do this. And that's why we do it together in church. And we try to get it right. Paul, if you read him in this holistic way, if you read him in this way where you're taking in everything he's written and trying to hold it together as one whole that may not be coherent, but that is a body of text from one person trying to make points across a whole bunch of situations. Paul is always describing a whole new countercultural, revolutionary way of living in and seeing the world. It's centered on cruciform love, and you can't proof text it or take it out of context. You have to read it as a whole. He isn't writing one-liners. There's one thing I put in my notes here. He's describing what God is like, cruciform, self-giving, loving, and in doing so, he's describing what we're called to be like as well. So Paul, above all else, he wants us to live these Christ-like lives, and he wants us to be in community with others doing the same thing. And in doing that, we serve the world, and we serve each other, and we hopefully make the world a little bit better place. So here's the shorthand way for reading Paul. I put it on the back of your sheet. It's a meme. Got it off Instagram. It popped up in my feed this week, and I was like, ooh, that's perfect. I love it. It doesn't mention Paul. Paul's not in here. It's not Paul drawing on Paul's verses. But I think if you were going to distill Paul's message into one meme that you could put on Facebook or whatever, or you could hold on to and put at people, this is the one. Genocide is biblical. Joshua. Loving your enemy is biblical, but only one is Christ-like. Slavery is biblical. Chain breaking is biblical, but only one is Christ-like. Patriarchy is biblical. Paul did it right here. Countercultural elevation of women is biblical. Paul did it in the next verse. Only one is Christ-like. Retributive violence is biblical. Grace-filled restoration is biblical, but only one is Christ-like. Segregation is biblical. Unity is biblical, but only one is Christ-like. Christ transforms, not the Bible. Be wary of those who know one, but not the other. Isn't that good stuff? So that's the rule. That's basically the rule that Paul is establishing, if you boil it down. Christ-like, cruciform, self-giving love, rooted in our freedom to have faith and hope and love for one another. We participate in that, and through that we live in this countercultural, inclusive community that's also contextual, because someday somebody's going to look back on us and be like, what in the world were they doing? But we're just all trying our best. And from this, it's from this that I get my love of Paul. And it's from this that I read Paul as opening the way, for instance, for one of my big preoccupations, which is universalism, the idea that everybody is saved at the end and everybody's welcomed into God. I get it from Paul, because Paul was opening up the doors. He was widening the doors back then, and we've been widening the doors for 2,000 years since then. The job is to keep widening those doors. Paul wasn't a universalist. He wasn't a progressive. He wasn't any of these modern terms, but he laid the groundwork that lets us do those things. All right? He takes those really important words of Jesus that is the key to what we do, which is the first thing we should read of the Bible, which is the Sermon on the Mount and Matthew 25, and then he applies it to the world and shows us how to apply Christ to those situations we live in. And we do it inclusively, we do it counterculturally, all right, we do it with love. And even to the point, this is the last thing I want to say, one of the theologians that I really like, Julie's going to shake her head when I say this.
Yeah.
I love Karl Barth. I love Karl Barth. Karl Barth is not I'm probably the first person to sit in Fellowship Church and say I love Karl Barth. Karl Barth was a universalist because he read Paul. Karl Barth's most important work that he ever wrote was the Epistle of the Romans. He did 550 pages on the book of Romans. It's fantastic. I read it this last winter again. It's really good. But because of that, he was a universalist. And not because Paul was a universalist. I got this quote from an article I read recently about Barth. It said, contrary to some theologians, Barth was less certain and more hope-filled on the question of universal salvation. In contemporary conversations, there are theologians who advocate for a Christian universalism on the basis of God's character, and others who advocate for a Christian universalism based on what God has done in Jesus. By contrast, if asked for his views on universal salvation, Barth might say something like, Scripture does not answer that specific question, but I hope we are all saved, although I cannot be certain. And he said that because of Paul, because Paul gave him that hope that we are called to be Christ-like and that God is Christ-like, which means God is all-loving and all-willing to give, and that God, it doesn't make a lot of logical sense that God is going to send people to hell forever. That's why I think Paul is really important. I hope this class has been somewhat informative and not too theologically dense. It's been a little too theologically dense for me at times, but I appreciate you all being here. And if you want to do 49 more weeks, just let Chris know. And we'll keep going next week with this. But thank you. I'm happy to answer questions or comments or anything. We still have, it's 10 till 10 right now. So I should be using the mic, by the way. I'm going to get yelled at.
Paul would not have gotten away with. I think Paul would not have gotten away with. So husbands, submit to your wives.
Yeah.
But I think we women would have liked that
Yeah.
now. But he probably, if the guy could kill his wife and all of his kids, that kind of puts it in the context.
Yeah, I think you're right. And if you think about, he's writing these letters to this church and trying to instruct them. And we've already seen, when we talked about that first week, about these struggles he's having with these super apostles and these other teachers, he's trying to establish credibility so that he can point them towards a cruciform life. And so if he comes out and says something really wild, like women or husbands submit to your wives, he's going to lose all credibility. And he's going to miss out on his broader point of what building a church and what it looks like. It's these baby steps. But we're 2,000 years on. We can take those baby steps, right? Yeah.
I think you kind of alluded to this, and maybe you said it more explicitly, but I just want to say one thing about Paul and sexual orientation. Mm-hmm. The concept of sexual orientation did not exist until the basically late 19th century. And so when we talk about Paul's admonishment to avoid same-sex encounters, sexual encounters, he's not talking about what we contemporarily understand as gay relationships. Mm-hmm. And so I just think it's really important to, it's contextual, like you've said, and countercultural. You don't yank a verse out and throw it at people anywhere in the Bible, but especially not in a complex theology like this. And so I think it's really important to underscore that Paul is not talking about what we understand to be sexual orientation.
Yeah, exactly. And it is. It's contextual. Like, I can have a guess of what Paul, a first century Jewish man in ancient Palestine, thought about same-sex relations as they were practiced at the time, but like that's a different time and place. And like we see a gospel that's more inclusive because of the groundwork Paul laid. And if they want to throw that verse at you, you can throw the one at him in 1 Corinthians when he also tells people don't get married because Jesus is coming like next week. Marriage is terrible, he says. So, just in general.
from a Jewish perspective, he says it's all about seed, because they were an agrarian people.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the traders in Europe, but the people that would have been in Jesus' context. And so the reason that you don't sleep with someone else's wife is because you don't plant your seeds where they don't belong.
Yeah.
And the reason you don't masturbate is because you don't spill your seed because it's wasted. And the reason you don't sleep with a man is that your seed can't procreate.
Yeah.
So it's just all about this agrarian mentality that they would have understood in their context, that has nothing to do with our context particularly.
Yeah.
It's just a different set of values.
It is. Especially reading this book on Gorman, where he goes through all of Paul's letters pretty closely. We just live in such a different time, and so many things when you're reading the Bible, just like these little jokes and verses and sayings, they just go over our head because we just live in a different time. And so if those little parts of language do, so much so, these big cultural concepts like seed, which is not even a way we think about the world. One that really stood out to me in this book, just a way of illustrating how differently people think. He talks about Paul's journeys, because the scholars are trying to reconstruct what Paul's journeys really were. And he talks about how we think about a journey as a map. You've got this topographical view of what this area looks like, and you're going to go from Corinth over here down to Thessalonica, and then across over here to Philippi, and then up to Galatia. They didn't think about that. They thought about the way of travel as beads on a string. You're going to go from this city, this city, this city, this city, because that's just how you went. You didn't have any other option. You couldn't take a flight from here to there. You had to go this way. It's just a completely, and so when he's reconstructing Paul's journeys, he's saying, you can't, for instance, he talks about the book of Titus, where we don't think Paul wrote that book. He's writing to somebody in Crete, and he basically debunks Titus being an authentic letter of Paul by saying, Crete doesn't fall into any of Paul's other journeys. He would have had to gone completely out of his way, and you weren't going to do that, because that was a complete, it would have been 6 months of wasted time in his life. So it's just a completely different way of thinking about the world that we just don't even, I think, comprehend. And when people are throwing single Bible verses at each other, you're participating in that. You're completely missing the point of what it would have been. So yeah, it's a good point.
Coming back to our previous discussions about Paul as a person, I can almost picture when he's addressing about submission. He starts off with the thing that they're all going to focus on anyway about what women should do. Mm-hmm. But then I could almost picture him thinking, okay, I'm going to have to back in this because somebody's going to take this to the nth degree.
Yeah.
We need to in case you're thinking, y'all also have.
Yeah. Well, and the thing to think about too, we talked about that first week, that it wasn't just a letter. They weren't just getting a piece of paper with these instructions. They were getting a letter with one of Paul's associates who would then explain things to them. So if he's passing Ephesians off to them and saying, women, submit to your husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, and the husbands are like, oh, okay, Paul. His associates are there to say, that's not what you think. You listen to what Paul says. Love your wives as Christ loved the church. Christ died on the cross. So, yeah.
I was listening to one of the Peter Enns Bible for Normal People.
Yeah.
They did one whole thing about intersex sexual identity,
Mm-hmm.
that thing. And I was surprised to learn that even Augustine, way back in the 3rd, 4th century, was talking about it. Would he use the term hermaphrodite, which is not the best term, but intersex probably is. And I was surprised that they were talking about that early.
Yeah.
He had a problem with, I think, the eunuchs more so than the intersex.
Yeah. Well, just, to get back to what Julie was talking about, just that concept of what same-sex relationships would have been. It would have been eunuchs who it wasn't a sexual thing. They were just looked down on in general. That's for who they were. They were, because eunuchs at the time worked often as in courts of rich and famous people. And so they were seen to be kind of sly and, mischievous and trying to undermine people. And then the other major instance of same-sex relations in first century world would have been between older men and younger boys, and it was a form of patronage. And so this idea, yeah, like of a loving, covenantal relationship, self-giving, loving relationship between two consenting adults, Paul wouldn't have even had that as a concept to think about. And so to say that Romans 1:27 condemns same-sex marriage in America in 2024 is just, I guess, I mean, you know.
The biblical concept of marriage means marriage between a man and at least one woman.
Yeah.
Right?
Biblical marriage, it's got a lot of different forms, that's for sure. So
That's why it's so hard to, and you know, when you read some of this, to read it in context, so because we so easily transpose our experience and reality to first century.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you for all the work you've put in. I know you've done a lot of appreciated work.
I've enjoyed it. It's been a blast. I was telling Tabitha yesterday, I think I could write a book about this. I think I've got nothing. So the number of things I've had to cut out. Chris, this is the first time I've taught an adult Sunday school class ever. I've taught a bunch of kids Sunday school class. And when I first came to Chris with my outline and stuff, he's like, you gotta cut. He's like, you have 3 weeks, 45 minutes. So I've had to cut a lot out, but it's been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed it. And I think I've got some other ideas of things in the future. I mean, I got paid to sit in my office and read about Paul and write about him, so you can't beat that. Can't beat that. All right.
If someone could take this sheet and do with it what some people have done with the signs in the yard and they become popular, or someone could incorporate artwork
Around that.
and put this, I'd buy one.
Yeah. I'll send that meme image to Scott to put in the email so you can have it. Yeah, that popped up on my timeline this week. I was like, oh my gosh.
Probably got too many characters to put on our sign out there.
Yeah. You can grab like a couple of those, and you don't have to have the whole thing. So, all right. Well, thanks, y'all. I appreciate it. I appreciate y'all coming.